In the last tutorial I showed how to connect to MongoDB and get JSON data into PySpark, and in this tutorial what I'll show you, following on from the last, is how to write an SQL query on top of that data. So I'll begin by going into the last script which I wrote for the connection, and I'll just go into that folder. I'll copy the last script. So the last script was the PySpark MongoDB connector.py, and I'll copy that and I'll call that tutorial 06 PySpark SQL. Okay, so what I'll do is now just go into Vim, and I'll just rerun that script. Just so that we can see what we did last time. Alright, so what it's done is connected to MongoDB, and I have returned the first row of data. The next thing I'll do is just modify that script. So there's a couple of things, there's a few things that we'll do. We're just going to get rid of showing the first row, and we'll show a few more rows. Okay, so we're showing the top 20, and this is truncated data. So there's just one thing I want to show you. So I have a collection within MongoDB for The Guardian, data coming in from The Guardian, which is a newspaper, UK newspaper, and I have that data going all the way back to January. So as you can see here, here is the date, and this is a Twitter formatted date, which is Friday, January the 24th. So that data goes all the way back to the current time or date, which is July 2020. So one of the things that I want to do is, in the real world, you don't really want to import all of that data from Mongo or whatever data source that you have. So you'd want to take a piece, a segment, or a filter of that data, and then you want to perform some type of operation on that data. So the good thing about Spark and the Mongo connector, which I'll show you, is what's called a pipeline. Now, what the pipeline does, as you retrieve that data, it puts a filter on that data, and then that way it just gets you back what you need. So it's quite similar to, if you were to write a query on a table and you were to do between a date range, or if you were to, put in a query and match particular strings, etc., just to filter it and get what you need back. So I'm just going to do some modifications. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, at the top, I'm just going to import colorama. Now this has nothing to do with Spark, but I find it really useful to have some sort of color coding on my code in the terminal, and I do that for Bash, I do that for Python, etc., and it just makes what's returned to the terminal easier to read. So I'll just import in this library. So that's colorama import for back and style. So for is for coloring the foreground, back is coloring the background, so background being behind the text, foreground being the text itself, and then we'll need to initialize auto reset equals true. Okay, so that gives me what I need, and I'm always making spelling mistakes, typos. And the next thing that I would want to import will be datetime, and I'm going to need to use datetime to do conversions on dates. So I'll import that. Okay, so here we have our input URI, we've got output URI, we have the instance for our Spark session, and we have our settings, we've got the Spark connector, and we are loading in and reading that data, and then we are showing it. So what I'll do, the first thing I'll do, I'm just going to put in some date variables, because what I would like to do, I would like to not retrieve all of the data going all the way back. So the first thing I'll do, I will create a couple of variables, and these variables will be my date range. So the date range I'm going to use to segment or filter the data. So I'll have a variable for date start, and I'll have one for date end. Now, where the date goes, it goes into what's called a pipeline. So a pipeline is a stage just before retrieving that data. So you're going in, querying that data, and bringing back what you need. And the value that we feed in will be a string. So I'll define that as a string, and we'll have datetime, which is the library I imported above. Datetime dot strip time, and I'll put a date range of May, and then I'll have to specify the date formatter. And then the format will be ISO. And there is a particular way in which you format that data. It must have the Z time zone symbol on the end. So the next one, and I have a typo, always doing typos. Will be the end date. And the end date will be the 31st. So we do a full month of May. Okay, so I think that looks okay. And where I'm going to use colorama, oh by the way, colorama, if you don't have it, it's a library which you import using pip, Python's package manager, and it's just really a sudo pip3 install colorama. And I find that really useful for debugging and just really kind of neatening up everything that I do in the command line in the terminal. So if you don't have it, that's how you install it. So I'm going to do a print, and here I use the foreground, and I'll specify green for my foreground. Actually, let's do white, and my background will be green. And then I'm going to use a f string which is date start, and I'll put in the variable date start, so that way I can show you what the string looks like. And the next one will be foreground white plus background, let's do cyan plus f string date end. And the reason why I like using f strings is because it just makes it so much easier to insert variables into your strings. You know, previously, you know, before, I think it was 3. I think it was before a particular version of 3. You would do something like format, and then you'd have your, just go back there. You'd have your variable, and then you'd this would be replaced by your variable. And with f strings, You don't need to have the format bit at the end. You can just have your brackets, and then you can put your variable name inside. So that is date end. Okay, I'll just quickly save that. So next I need to create a pipeline, and I will call my variable pipeline, and the pipeline will be a key value pair dictionary, and instead of using it the Pythonic way, instead of creating it the Pythonic way, I will create it as a string. So the first key will be match, and I much prefer to create a string because it's easier to read. And we'll use the AND operator. And you'll see in a sec, I'll build the string first, and then I'll talk about what's happening and what it is. Okay, I haven't finished yet, but I'll explain the first bit. So the first key which I'm using is match, and when you build a pipeline that queries data from MongoDB, you're using the aggregation match query. So that's why I have the key match. And then the AND operator, you'll see me finish this. What that pretty much means is it's going to be AND between created date of a specific start date to an end date. And I'll just finish that bit so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so just a quick inspection. I think that might look okay. So the match and the and I've explained. Here you have a date, which is created at date, and you have greater than, and then you also have less than. So the LT is less than, the GT is greater than. So you've got created at date, which is my field, which is a column inside of Mongo, in my Mongo data, and here you have the date start string variable, and you have the date end string variable. So it's pretty much like SQL if you wanted to query data within a particular date range. And so the operators for Mongo, they have a $, so match and greater than, less than, and then the date is just says to Mongo this is a date string. And when you use the pipeline, when you do the pipeline via Spark, it's a little bit different to writing a query directly to Mongo. In Mongo, you would have to use a date object. And how that's different is that we're using strings in the pipeline for date. Okay. So the next bit which I'm going to do, I'm going to add to my query. I am going to add another column which is full text, and these are all Twitter columns. So actually the created at date, that is a field which I created. So when I inserted the data, I created an additional field called created at date, where I've formatted the date as a date object. So when you get dates in from Twitter, you've got a field which is called created at, and it's a string. So I've already done my pre-processing when inserting the Twitter data into Mongo. So that's why I'm able to use dates and not having to redo that. Okay, so for the full text, I'm going to use some regex. So I could be very specific. I can look for specific strings within full text, but I'm just going to use some regex to specify what I need. And what I like about Mongo is pretty clean when writing a regex command. And you'll see how that looks. Okay, and that should be our query. So just need to close that. Give that another check. So I've got my match, I've got my and, I've got my dates, I've got my full text, and in the full text I just need to put a pattern which I'm going to search for. So I'm just going to put in there COVID, as in COVID-19, and this is all data coming from The Guardian. There was a lot of reporting about COVID-19 this year, so we'll see how many results come back for that. Just clean this up a little. Let's just put this after the instance. Okay, I think that looks good. So I'll just double check that one more time. If it's incorrect, then we'll get some errors and then we'll just go back and correct them. Okay, so the next thing I need to do, I need to add the pipeline to my query. And the parameter name will be pipeline. Just open that up a bit. As I said, I've got really small keys on my keyboard, so I'm always jumping around the place, hitting the wrong keys. And we'll put the variable in there, which I've named pipeline. Okay, so I think that looks good. And I'll save that. And I'm sure there's going to be an error in here somewhere. So I'm just having a quick scan. I think that might be okay. Okay, I think we can run that. Okay, there we have an error. Let's go back and correct it. Line 42. Line 43. Still an error on line 43. I'm sure you can see the mistake. I can't see it. Line 43. Just do that one more time. Okay, so I can see what my error is. This is actually, the AND operator is actually a list. So that should be square brackets. Okay, let's give that a try. Okay, I can see my error. There you go. Okay, so that's worked, and I'll just go to the top. So this is my example of making things a little more easier to read in the terminal. So this is the use of colorama. I've got my date start and my date end strings, and this pretty much is what it looks like, and that's what the datetime does. So you know, I could have just put that. I could have just created that string, you know. But the reason why I use datetime is because typically you would use a variable. You know, that date could be coming from a variable, and you just need to convert it, right? So that's why you'd use datetime to do that conversion. So let's look at the date. So I have May. So before it was January the 24th, I now have May the 2nd. And it's showing the top 20 rows. So let's look at some of the text, and you can see you know, you can see in some of them we've got COVID. So in all of them you would have COVID, and yeah, so that's worked. So we've narrowed it down by date, and we have also just selected the rows within that date range which have the string COVID. Okay. So now the next thing I want to do, I want to do an SQL query, right? So let's do some more modifications. So for my SQL query, there's a couple of things that I need to do. First, I need to create a view, and the second thing I need to do is write my SQL query. So I'll start off with the view, and what the view is, it's just a temporary like a table which you can then use SQL formatted query on. So that will be df create or replace temp view, and we'll give that a name, and I'll call that Twitter user timeline guardian. And for the second part, I will write my SQL query string, and that will be a select ID created at full text, and I've got another column in there which is text from Twitter user timeline Guardian, and then I need to run that query into a new data frame to create a new data frame, and that would be pyspark.sql and SQL query. Okay. Alright, so what's going to happen, I'm going to run this code, and instead of seeing that large preview of the data frame, then you're going to see the execution of this SQL query where I've just requested the ID, created at, full text, and text. So ID is the ID which is given to each Twitter feed, I guess, tweet. Created at is the actual date string which is provided by Twitter. I had modified that to created at date. That is the column which I named it when I converted that string into a date object when I inserted it into Mongo. So even though I'm querying created at date, I'm just requesting the original column which is called created at. Then full text, you have to specify in the Twitter API whether it's full text you need. If it isn't, then it defaults to text. Now somewhere in the year I hadn't specified full text, and it was just giving me the default text. That's why I have both full text and text columns. Alright, so let's run that. Okay, so I didn't specify new df, so let's just modify that, and now we can run it. Okay, there you go. So that looks a little bit neater. It's easier to query, and we're just requesting 4 columns. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. So let's do a couple more other things. So let's open up these columns a bit. So these are being truncated. So we'll just open them up, and to do that we'll say truncate equals false. So we'll turn off truncation. Okay, so there we have it. We've got truncation turned off so we can see the full text, and in each of these we will have the string COVID. So COVID, 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 etc., etc., etc. So there was a lot going on this year, as we all know, due to COVID. Now that's just giving me the top 20 rows. So let me get all of the rows, because what I want to do, I just want to validate that I'm getting all of the data within the date range. So just so that we can see that. So what I would like to show you is, let's remove the truncate equals false, and within new df.show we'll then put in a count of the rows. Right, so when you do a show, it defaults to 20 if you don't specify the number of rows you need. If, for example, I put in 30, 40, 50, then that's how many rows it will show. But because I want to show all of the data, for all of the rows, then I need to do a count of the number of rows which are in the data frame. So that is the new underscore df dot count. So it's really the dot count. So save that and let's run it. Okay, so I had specified a date range between the 1st to the 31st of May. So I've got from the 2nd to the 31st. So that's the verification that all of the data within that date range has appeared and everything contains the keyword COVID. And yeah, that's an SQL query, nice and straightforward. Cheers.